The first and only time that I felt scared about the house. I remember walking in through the kitchen and looking into the living room. It's nighttime, and it felt incredibly foreboding, like it wanted us out. Says Gunnar, it really didn't feel like home. It felt dark and oppressive and aggressive, and we packed up all our stuff and moved. No one will ever again live in the house that Errol Flynn built. Its first and third owners are dead before their time, one by slow suicide and the other by recklessness. The second and longest running master of Mulholland is the last to pass on. No nonsense Stuart Hamblen dies of brain cancer on March 8, 1989, 30 years after the night the pipes had first rattled at Mulholland Farm. Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. I'm Jennifer, so happy to have you here. It's time for episode 11 of Errol Flynn Slept Here. Errol Flynn Slept Here is a fantastic book, and I gotta tell you, growing up, I didn't really know anything about Errol Flynn beyond the fact that he played Robin Hood famously on the big screen. But there's so much to this man. It is such a study in human tragedy. He was larger than life, and he burned out and perished at the age of 50. It's crazy the amount of living this man packed into 50 years. But now in the book, we are coming to chapter 9. It is called Consumed by Mulholland. Now, in the last episode, Errol has already passed in October of 1959. But did he ever really leave his beloved Mulholland house and Mulholland Farm, the house and the grounds that he built from the ground up high in the hills above Hollywood? That was his refuge. That was his playground. That's where Errol got into all kinds of shenanigans up there. Now, the owners that took over Mulholland House and the farm, the property surrounding Mulholland House, after Errol died, was Stuart Hamblen and his family. Now, they stayed at the farm for 20 years. 20 years that the Hamblens inhabited Mulholland House were very happy ones. Stuart Hamblen and Susie Hamblen, his wife, had a big extended family, and they all would gather up in Mulholland Farm for every type of family gathering you can imagine. They had wonderful, wonderful times up there. Stuart was in of himself very, very famous. He was a radio and television cowboy singing personality. He starred in films. He was friends with superstars like Ronald Reagan, John Wayne. He had famous gospel songs. He wrote songs for a lot of famous singers, including Elvis Presley. So Stuart was a very, very famous man in his own right. Really amazing is that Errol Flynn has, of course, a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame, as does the second owner of Mulholland House, Stuart Hamblen. And now, episode 11, chapter 9, we're going to dive into the third and final owner of Mulholland House, Rick Nelson and his family. If you don't know who Rick Nelson is, you might have heard of the famous 1950-1960 television show that ran for 14 super popular seasons. It was called The Adventures of Ozzie and Harriet. And it was Ozzie and Harriet Nelson and their two boys, David and Ricky Nelson. And it was a family fun sitcom. Ran for 14 years. And Ricky Nelson shot to superstardom during the run of that show when he started singing at the age of 16. And in the 50s, he became a teenage pop star idol himself. And Ricky had 4 children of his own, 3 of which you may know. And if you're a Gen Xer like me, you probably know the 3 children that actually were famous. Tracy Nelson, who famously starred in the movie Down and Out in Beverly Hills. She played Richard Dreyfuss's daughter. She was also in that really fun 80s sitcom called Square Pegs. And then her younger twin brothers, Matthew and Gunnar Nelson, they were the twin pop rock singing duo that was called Nelson, that exploded in the early 90s. So now we're going to get into the last and final phase. And Rick Nelson is the third and final owner of Mulholland Farm and House. So it's very interesting to know that all 3 famous occupants of Mulholland House and Farm, Errol, Stuart Hamblen, and Ricky Nelson, all have stars on the Hollywood Walk of Fame, and they all lived at Mulholland. And the house and the farm really symbolized important eras in each individual man's life. In this chapter, let's find out about when Rick arrived at the house and what his family's experience was at Mulholland House. It wasn't as sweet and this sort of soft family environment that the Hamblen family experienced. There was a lot of dark aspects to what happened to the Nelson family while they were living at Mulholland House. So let's get into it. Chapter 9, Consumed by Mulholland. The adventures of the Nelsons at Mulholland began unexpectedly. I remember him coming home one day, recalls Rick Nelson's son, Gunnar. He said, "I found the most amazing house. It's incredible, and we're going to move there." You have to understand, the house we were living in was in better homes and gardens. Gunnar's twin brother Matthew says of Mulholland Farm, "When we got it from the Hamblens, I remember it was pretty run down. You could look back on it and say, wow, it must have been something in its day, but by the time we got there, the paint was chipping and you could smell the dry rot." Eric Hilliard Nelson, America's teenaged rock and roller Rick Nelson, had seen the unveiling of his own star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame in 1975, a year before Stuart Hamblen. Ricky Nelson had spent 14 years on the hit series The Adventures of Ozzie and Harriet, which vaulted him to 30 top 40 hits by the age of 22. In 1959, he had reached his zenith as a young gunslinger in the Warner Brothers Western Rio Bravo with John Wayne and Dean Martin. Ozzie and Harriet would continue for 7 more years, and during that time, in April 1963, he married Kristen Harmon, daughter of Michigan football star Tom Harmon and actress Elise Knox, in what had been billed the wedding of the year. The run of Ozzie and Harriet lasted after 435 episodes. In 1966, 14 years before Rick Nelson buys Mulholland. He had begun the show at age 12. He ended it a married man of 26, with most of his hits already behind him. They were beyond. And I remember in the 80s, in the summertime, watching a lot of these old retro shows from the 50s and 60s, and Ozzie and Harriet really was one of my favorites because it was such a sweet, family, fun, situational comedy. And I remember watching Rick Nelson and thinking, oh my gosh, he was such a dreamboat. I mean, so stinking cute when he was little. And then as he grew up, he was very, very handsome. Challenges facing former child stars have been well documented in the past generation. Nelson makes the transition out of the television grind without adverse effects. He's well-mannered, armed with a long fuse, almost painfully shy, and remains every bit as quiet and self-effacing for the remainder of his life. He returns to the spotlight in 1972 when his cynical and world-weary song Garden Party shoots to number 6 on the Billboard Hot 100. Recorded with his Stone Canyon Band, Garden Party is a thinking man's view of a reunion concert at Madison Square Garden in 1971 that included Little Richard, Chuck Berry, and others. If you haven't heard that song, I will link the music video to it down below. I love the song Garden Party. It's such a good song. Music industry peers in attendance that night include John Lennon, George Harrison, and Bob Dylan. Nelson wears the fashion of the day, his hair shaggy, his shirt velvet, and his pants bell-bottomed. "No one recognized me," he says in Garden Party. "I didn't look the same." At one point, while playing his new material, boos rained down on him as the audience, there for a look back, appreciate neither his new look nor his new music, and they want to hear only his old hits. "You can't please everyone, so you gotta please yourself," is his response in the song. Garden Party reveals the depth and sensitivity of Rick Nelson, a performer then 31 years old, who would rather drive a truck than feed the public's appetite for nostalgia. Early in 1980, Rick learns that Mulholland Farm is for sale. He's familiar with the property because his father loved the place and had played tennis there with Flynn, and Rick pounces on the opportunity. And it's so cool when you read about the history of Mulholland House and Farm. When Errol lived there, he was really good friends with Ronald Reagan. And, Ronald would come for dinner parties and things because Errol was very famous for throwing these really lavish Hollywood parties. And Errol passed and Stuart Hamblen moved into Mulholland House with his brood. He was also friends with Ronald Reagan. So Ronald Reagan would come to Stuart's home. Obviously, Ronald Reagan was the president of the US, but before he became president, he was the governor of California and he was involved in local California politics. So Stuart Hamblen would host political gatherings and things with Ronald Reagan. So it's just really cool when you think about all the interconnectedness of everyone that had been in and out of that house and those grounds. It's just crazy. So Rick hears about the house and the grounds for sale, and he just pounced on it. And Lisa Hamblen, who was Stuart and Susie Hamblen's daughter, said it sold quick. Rick pays $750,000 for Mulholland Farm in April 1980, financing part of the sale through the Hamblens. Rick and Kristen move into the house with their 4 children, Tracy, she's the eldest, the twins, Matthew and Gunnar, and their youngest son, Sam. He was very proud of the fact that it was the Errol Flynn Ranch, said Matthew Nelson. He was always kind of looking for secret passageways and things that he had read about in My Wicked, Wicked Ways. That is Errol's famous autobiography. Hold, please. Here's my copy of My Wicked, Wicked Ways. If you're looking for a page turner, this one is it, you guys. And in the coming up episodes, there's some really insightful, deep passages that Errol writes about looking back on his life, everything he feels that he's learned, everything he feels that he's stuck in tragically. It's crazy. And I'm going to read to you a little bit more from My Wicked, Wicked Ways for some of the final chapters, but I have read from that book in earlier episodes, and it's always fun to read. That one is literally a page turner. I've told you guys before, when I first got that book, I would start reading it at night in bed and hours would go by and I would look at the clock and I would be like, okay, I started reading at 10 and now it's 1 a.m. What am I doing? I have to go to bed. So it's a really good book. It's one of the, I think it's one of the best-selling celebrity autobiographies of all time. It's crazy. And it was published after Errol died. So sadly, he didn't know about the success of that book, but okay. So they move in. Matthew Nelson is saying that his father, Rick Nelson, was very, very proud of the fact that it was the Errol Flynn Ranch, because obviously he read about it in My Wicked, Wicked Ways. Tracy Nelson realizes the mistake Flynn had made in 1941. The front door was in a place where it shouldn't have been, she says, so we never used it. Because of that, I never really felt that the house had a heart. It had no center. Like all the owners and families who live there, the Nelsons enter through the garage or the kitchen. Now, keep that in mind, what Tracy said. She really felt like the house had no heart, no center. And I touch upon the ghost story, the most famous ghost story that Tracy shares about her time when she was living at Mulholland House. And that's in episode 1. That's why you got to get on this playlist. Okay, so where are we? Okay, it says, early on, Tracy and her brothers noticed a strange energy about the house. When I was going to school, she says, girls would have slumber parties, but nobody would stay at my house. Gunnar says, that house was seriously haunted. There was a lot of activity when we were up there. It kind of freaked a lot of people out. It didn't freak me out at all, but it's one of the things I remember most. Adds Matthew, I don't really know if it came from the fact that Errol Flynn owned the place and weird stuff happened up there back in his day, but it always felt like the house had a history. I wasn't a big fan of 1940s movies at the time. He was a huge star and I knew who he was, but even if I had no idea that somebody famous lived in the house, I would have felt like there was something attached to it that wasn't normal. The same month that he buys Mulholland, Rick Nelson signs a small but important 2-album deal with Capitol Records. A year earlier, he had hosted the popular Saturday Night Live, then with its original cast. After the taping, he had endured John Belushi's ramblings about producing Nelson's next album. Belushi is one half of the Blues Brothers, another great movie, whose album is then at number 1. The private and careful Nelson bristles at the idea of being under the supervision of Belushi, but nurtures an idea of his own, to be produced by John Fogerty, the genius behind Creedence Clearwater Revival, also known as CCR. But as Nelson had demurred on Belushi's offer, Fogerty does the same to Nelson. Rick finds another producer and, in an excruciating process, completes the new album called Playing to Win, his first new album in 4 years. Nelson's sound has been described as rockabilly, pop, and rock, although he says with conviction on Playing to Win, call it what you want, it's all right, it's rock and roll to me. The album seems an effort, conscious or otherwise, to sum up his life to this point, with songs called Don't Look at Me and Do the Best You Can. On the track The Loser Babe Is You, Nelson seems to revisit the theme of Garden Party. Late in the year, Nelson hires a crackerjack media representative and begins promoting Playing to Win. One of a small army of reporters scheduling an interview is Reagan McCannon, a features writer for a West Coast tabloid called BAM, who flies down from San Francisco. So Rick Nelson leads her on a half-hearted tour of Mulholland Farm. She writes at the time, the irony was almost too hard to take. Wholesome as milk, Rick Nelson, the docent of one of Hollywood's most sordid secret playpens. And of course, she's referring to the house in its heyday when Errol lived there. The writer McCann remembers walking in the door and staring at a full-length oil portrait of Nelson as Colorado from the movie Rio Bravo. Today, she describes a tasteful interior and a lot of family photos. In reality, Rick and Kristen's storybook marriage is in shambles. Buying Mulholland is a couple's last hurrah, and 3 months prior to this interview, Chris has filed for divorce. She's still living on the premises in Flynn's bedroom upstairs, while Rick claims the downstairs bedroom with the two-way mirror. It will be a difficult interview, torture for a writer on assignment. Of all the people I've interviewed in my entire career, Rick Nelson was the least talkative. I had pages and pages of questions. In this case, he gave so many one-word answers that I could get nothing out of him. But then we talked about the house, and he lit up at the thought of Errol Flynn, who had all these parties right here. One other thing makes an impression on Reagan McCannon, now the longtime book editor of the San Francisco Chronicle. Of all the people I've ever interviewed, Rick Nelson was the most handsome. It was unbelievable. He was jaw-droppingly beautiful and yet so shy. He was the opposite of someone full of himself. He seemed like a really nice, gentle guy. There was no edge to be provoked. But Rick Nelson is leading a life that in some ways parallels Errol Flynn's. Rick's expenses exceed his income. In Chris Nelson's short time as the mistress of Mulholland, she spends $100,000 on decorating. She installs in various rooms black carpet, white carpet, or red carpet. She paints the interior doors and some of the trim black. She fills the house with Victorian antiques and contemporary artwork. In February 1981, Tom Schneider brings The Tomorrow Show to Mulholland Farm for a taping with the Nelson brothers, David and Rick. Around the same time, Rick appears on The Tonight Show with guest host David Letterman, who jokes about Rick Nelson now sleeping under Errol Flynn's infamous two-way mirror.
Just a home owned by Errol Flynn?
Yeah, well, it was a house that he built off of, right overlooking Hollywood, or the valley, really.
Enormous, huh?
It's good size, It is. Interesting, because my dad used to play tennis up there at his house, and my mom said, I know when it was in escrow and stuff, it was his favorite house, and I hadn't realized that, but it's got a real good feeling, and it's, got a lot of pool there.
He had a rather colorful life. Do you have any...
a lot of mirrors.
Mirrors, are there? Where would, like on the medicine chest, mirrors there, or...?
No, there's a mirror over the bed,
That's unusual? Secret passages or any of that?
There are, yeah. It's a room now, but it used to be a sun deck, and he used to have a little hole there, and he'd look into the living room and be able to see who was there,
So he always had a pretty good idea of folks coming and going in his house?
Yeah, he did.
Yeah.
In its own area, so it's pretty well protected in that way,
Fairly well secluded?
Yeah.
Oh man, you can definitely see how shy and soft-spoken Rick Nelson was just on the basis of that clip. And I've always been fascinated by very, very famous people that are so soft-spoken and shy like that. And a lot of them are really electric performers, like a Rick Nelson, like an Elvis Presley. When you saw them being interviewed, they always were very soft-spoken and so humble. I really, really am drawn to that. And that's why so many of us really don't like these narcissistic type personalities that are so loud and full of themselves. And usually those are the ones that aren't really all that talented, in my opinion. So he goes on the David Letterman show, jokes about being under that two-way mirror that Errol built. But there isn't much that's humorous about Rick Nelson's life. He is paying a $6,000 monthly mortgage payment for Mulholland. Chris, his wife, is spending maniacally. All 4 children are in private schools, and to maintain his family's lifestyle, he has to play up to 250 concerts a year in bars, county fairs, and even trade shows. I really like the fair, says Rick. I can get a whole wide variety of people who have never heard me, little kids, 10, 12, 13. Their parents who bring them know me from a completely other thing. It gives me a good feeling when the kids accept me and the music. Oh, that's sweet. Because seriously, think about how so many arrogant celebrities and maybe aging out singers of today would be totally pissed that they would have to play a trade show or a fair or something. But Rick's like, yeah, I'm happy to do it. I mean, he sounds like a really nice guy. He loves his music. It's the music that makes him happy and keeps him sane, especially after the divorce papers from Kristen are filed. As Flynn used to do, Nelson is constantly hitting the road to raise money. And as Flynn used to do, Nelson accepts the attention of an endless parade of women. Rick Nelson doesn't have to make a pass any more than Flynn did. He needs only to make himself available for the taking. Rick Nelson also tours to provide a geographical buffer from Chris. The estranged wife counters by sometimes traveling to his performances for in-person embarrassments or by having legal papers served before the curtain goes up. Alan Bush, Nelson's road manager, states, The one time I heard him get really angry was when one of the lawsuits came in, and for Rick to throw out a couple of cuss words was pretty amazing. Mulholland remains a place that Matthew and Gunnar call home, even after the court orders them to live with their mother in Brentwood. I went through a lot of hard times in that house, says Gunnar. Our parents' marriage was falling apart, not only dramatically, but spectacularly. They were doing it publicly, and it was awful. With the boys all gone to live with Chris or her family, Tracy remains at Mulholland until she leaves for college and finds an apartment. Now Rick Nelson lives alone at Mulholland Farm, with only a Polish houseman staying in the far side of the house in the bedroom by the kitchen where Alex Polvenko and Marge Eddington had resided. For Rick Nelson, life is reduced to an exhausting schedule on tour and the periods of recovery at Mulholland. And Alex Polvenko was the Russian. He was kind of like a butler, like a jack of all trades guy that lived with Errol, and he was kind of like a bouncer for his parties. He would kind of run everything for Errol. He would get all of Errol's leftovers, like the women that Errol didn't want. He would just funnel them over to Alex. So he was kind of like bartender. He was like everything. So he was kind of like this guy that I guess you could probably call him a hanger-oner. And Marge Eddington was Nora Eddington, who was the second wife of Errol. That was Nora's stepmother. And even after Errol divorced Nora, Madge stayed behind for a few years and managed all of Errol's affairs. So I guess Rick's guy, his Polish houseman, is staying in the same bedroom that those two did. So see how everything's just kind of connected? It's kind of crazy. Matthew says, my dad, now this is Matthew Nelson, Rick Nelson's one of his twin boys. He says, my dad had a fairly nocturnal existence while he was there, so the windows were taped up. He did the Elvis treatment on the windows in his bedroom. He'd just come in off the road exhausted, and he'd go in there and hibernate and come out at night. Gunnar says, to be honest with you, I think the house consumed my dad. After the marriage ended, he really did become quite the recluse. He woke up at 4 p.m. and walked around in his bathrobe and visited the Mr. Coffee and never left the house. He had never been that guy before that house. He became the tin foil on the windows kind of guy, and that was not who he was. But I can honestly say that there was an energy to that house that led to it. Divorce proceedings drag on for more than 2 years, ending in December 1982. Rick Nelson faces staggering legal bills, alimony payments, and that ever-present mortgage. In 1983, he lets his aunt, Connie Nelson, ex-wife of Ozzy's brother Don, he let her put Mulholland on the market with an asking price of $1.3 million. In October 1983, following an interview, he stands on the steps near the pool and he says to a reporter, I don't know why I live here. It's much too big for me, and I'm here all alone. At around this time, Connie Nelson takes artist Robert Florsack, a Flynn fan, on a tour of Mulholland Farm that confirms the hard times faced by Rick Nelson. No one was home, and she didn't want me to take pictures inside the house. Oh, I guess this is Robert, the guy that the real estate agent, his aunt, is showing around. No one wanted me to take pictures inside because they were about to put it up for sale, but we went through the whole place. The house was surprisingly downbeat. There wasn't much thought to the furnishings, especially upstairs. The boys had their guitars and their amps up there, and my impression was that Rick Nelson's whole focus was his career, and he didn't care about his surroundings. As long as he had a decent home with a roof over his head, he was okay. Rick Nelson hits the road again in 1984, earning $500,000 in an exhausting series of playdates. He comes close to returning to stardom. Paul McCartney wants to produce an album for him and to play bass and sing background vocals, but Capitol Records says no. Tracy has become an actress, bringing new fame to the family, and Rick keeps touring. And the parallels with Errol Flynn deepen. Nelson starts keeping company with a young model and actress named Helen Blair, who is 16 years his junior. Blair instantly becomes central to Nelson's life, as young Beverly Adeline had been central to Flynn's. Nelson's association with Blair alienates his mother Harriet and his brother David. Well, I guess apparently his mom and his brother didn't like the fact that she was so young. Rick appears on Solid Gold, The Midnight Special, and Good Morning America, and plays the Roxy on Sunset Strip. As he pursues his aggressive schedule, a new musical force arises back at Mulholland Farm. Says Gunnar Nelson, "Our mom wanted nothing to do with music at all. The fact that her 2 teenage sons were so into music, she didn't want that around, so she thought that by making us move our equipment out of that house in Brentwood because of the neighborhood complaints, that it would end the whole musical thing we were doing. But it kind of backfired on her because as isolated as that house was on Mulholland, it was a great thing for us to get away from our mom, keep our sanity, and weather a really tough divorce that was hard for the family. It was our safe haven, and we were able to put our instruments in the middle bedroom with the fireplace, and we rehearsed forever. We spent like 5 years there developing our sound, and it was nice to hitch a ride up to the house, and when Pop was in town, visit with him, and get to work on what would later become the Nelson sound. If we didn't have that access, then there's no way we could have developed our music." So basically, Mulholland Farm was the genesis of Nelson. The boys enjoyed the freedom of Mulholland, and Rick forced out on the road to try to keep it. A deal nearly materializes wherein a wealthy Rick Nelson fan would buy the title to the house and allow the Nelsons to live there rent-free, but nothing had been placed in writing. Meanwhile, the extensive touring causes the band to take a drubbing on commercial airline fares and schedules. In May 1985, Rick spends $118,000 on a World War II-era DC-3 plane, one of the most reliable ever built, but it was still at that time a 41-year-old aircraft, and it was to be used exclusively for touring. In August, he flies up and down the West Coast for concerts with Fats Domino, and in September, he takes the plane to Memphis to participate in an all-star recording session that includes Jerry Lee Lewis, Carl Perkins, Roy Orbison, and Stuart Hamblen's old friend, Johnny Cash. At a media event for the session, John Fogerty watches Rick Nelson make his appearance at the party. Says Fogerty, "What I perceived was a very shy man. He smiled that nervous smile and went away. And what's so cool is the people that Rick was singing with in Memphis, Lee Lewis, Carl Perkins, and Johnny Cash, that was part of what they called the $1 Million Quartet, that really, really famous recording session that had those same men and Elvis. If I can find a picture of it, I'll put it up here somewhere. So, Rick went and sang Same Men. I mean, that must have been such a moment for him. The next day will feature the Farm Aid benefit in Champlain, Illinois, and many of the stars in attendance in Memphis head there. Rick and his band decide to go too, but the DC-3 suffers engine trouble on takeoff and the trip is canceled. It will be the first of several incidents with the plane. One band member states, "Everyone hated it and nobody would really listen. It was like the main thing everyone always talked about." And I talked about that in the very, very first episode of this series. That plane just had mechanical problems from the very beginning when Rick bought that plane. It was constantly in need of repairs and parts they had to order, or they would, like for that, they would try to take off. They couldn't leave. It was crazy. And I don't understand why Rick, to entertain the idea that, hey, this is okay to still keep traveling around in this thing. It was just so sad. And not only that, but his kids said in a lot of interviews after his death that they hated the fact that their dad would get in that rinky-dink thing and travel all around just because it was just not a good plane. And, it just wasn't in good working order. And they were just always like so worried about him. So it's just really sad that he didn't just give up that tin can and just go find something that was more reliable. But he, continued to travel around in it. When Rick Nelson returns home, he finds that Matthew and Gunnar, now 18, have hurried to Mulholland to live with their father. "We occupied the upstairs," says Matthew. "He occupied the downstairs. We were getting along great and everything was fantastic." Reagan McCann, who had interviewed Nelson at Mulholland 4 years earlier, attends a concert during this time at a club in Berkeley, California. "It was an intimate setting," she says. "It seemed like his career was on the upswing, like he was going to gain back some rock fans. His voice was as strong and sweet as ever. I had high hopes for the guy." His son Matthew agrees. He was starting to get out of his shell. He was starting to get more social. Christmas 1985 features a Mulholland Farm celebration with Rick, Helen, all 4 of his children, and a rare get-together with his mom and brother. "We had a really great party," says Matthew. "Our grandmother was there. Our family was there. It was good for him. He felt really good. He looked like he was complete again. If I look back on it spiritually, it was kind of cool that he actually had some sense of familial closure and redemption." Next day, Rick embarks on a brief tour to raise cash and boards his vintage 1944 DC-3 with a revitalized Stone Canyon band to play 3 dates: Orlando, Florida, Guntersville, Alabama, and Dallas, Texas. After playing Guntersville, the band boards the DC-3 on New Year's Eve and heads for Love Field in Dallas. The plane crosses the border into Texas, and Dallas Air Traffic Control hears a message from the 33-year-old pilot. "I think I'd like to turn around, head for Texarkana here. I've got a little problem." That little problem is a fire that breaks out in the right aft section of the fuselage at 6,000 feet. In seconds, smoke fills the cockpit. The pilot, a veteran of only 150 hours in this DC-3, realizes that he won't be able to use any of the vectors provided for nearby airports. He tries for an emergency landing in a farm near DeKalb, Texas. At 5:14 p.m., the plane makes a perfect three-point emergency landing in a field, but crashes into trees and rough terrain. The pilot and co-pilot escape through the cockpit emergency hatch, while the passengers are consumed in the flames filling the cabin. Rick Nelson, Helen Blair, 4 other members of the Stone Canyon Band, and their sound man. Gunnar Nelson walks into Mulholland and learns of the plane crash from Dan Rather on the CBS Evening News. Matt hears it on the car radio. The third owner of Mulholland Farm is gone. The National Transportation Safety Board suspects that the space heater had caused the fire. During flight, the crew was unable to start the cabin heater, despite repeated attempts by the captain. Smoke then entered the cabin. A rumor claimed that drug use had caused the fire, yet such a charge could have no basis in fact since there was no surviving eyewitnesses to activities in the cabin, and the fire was gasoline-fed, meaning that it must have emanated from the fuel line to the heater. The pilot had told the co-pilot at the crash scene, quote, "Don't mention the heater," end quote. And there's a picture in the chapter of the Telegram talking about Rick's death, and it says, on December 31st, 1985, teletype machines pounded out the grim news of the crash of a DC-3 in Texas. The plane carried Rick Nelson and his band. The astonished Nelson children heard the news on radio and television. Authorities apparently made no attempt to notify family members. And I remember hearing those reports. I was at a party at my aunt and uncle's house for New Year's Eve, and I was 11 at the time, and my cousin and I loved Ricky Nelson, and we loved his songs and his music because we were watching those reruns growing up, and we were crying, and I just remember us being so unbelievably sad to know that Rick Nelson died. I was so sad. Nelson is laid to rest at Forest Lawn, Hollywood Hills, overlooking the Warner Brothers studios, where he had made Rio Bravo, and where Errol Flynn's 17-year career had financed the building of Mulholland Farm, the place they both loved. Gunnar says, "To this day, I remember when our dad was getting ready to go on the road with his big green suitcases at the bottom of the stairs, waiting for the car to arrive to take him to the airport. It's still in my mind, seeing him on the Flynn staircase looking down, waiting for those bags to be at the bottom when he came back from the road. It feels to me like he's, still on the road and hasn't come home." Matt and Gunnar live at Mulholland for 2 more months after Rick's death. Then late one evening, everything changes. Matt recalls, ultimately they would find fame and multi-platinum record sales beginning in 1990 with the band Nelson, then glam rock, and in the tradition of their father, they continued to write and perform. "A lot of the time we're playing the same venues he played," says Matt. "We performed at the Universal Amphitheater, and I remember thinking he'd be so proud if he were here." Youngest brother Sam also works in the music industry, and Tracy's acting career continues on television and in theatrical films. She is a 20-year survivor of Hodgkin's disease. And there is a picture of Gunnar Nelson standing in front of that famous oil painting of his father's, where he is depicted as the character Colorado from that famous film he made called Rio Bravo. And it says, weeks before performing with his brother Matt in a series of June 2008 Rick Nelson tribute shows, Gunnar Nelson poses with the painting of his father as Colorado from the film Rio Bravo. This painting once hung in the entryway at Mulholland Farm. Of the lack of Nelson photos at Mulholland from this period, Gunnar said, "Mom and Dad were going through a divorce at that time, and I think people were so focused on staying sane through the insane time that taking fun family pictures was not on their priority list." An aerial photo of the house and the grounds from the farm and the tennis courts. And it says, "This aerial photo was taken by the Hamblen family when Mulholland Farm went on the market in the late 1970s. the compact nature of the house and wings is evident, and it is a second-story renovation of the nursery into another bedroom where the hauntings would be reported by Tracy and Gunnar Nelson. Also depicted in the photo is a dramatic drop-off of the hillside to an observation deck from which the guests could watch Errol Flynn's tennis matches on the court below. And there's also a picture of the house when Rick Nelson called upon his Aunt Connie to help him sell the house when he was undergoing those financial troubles. And it said, the divorce from Kristen Harmon Nelson is final, and Rick Nelson needs to raise cash. In 1983, he contacts his aunt, real estate agent Connie Nelson, to put his beloved Mulholland Farm on the market for a cool $1.3 million, $650,000 more than what he had paid for it just 3 years earlier. There's a really cool picture of Rick, who was 18 years old, playing the famous Colorado character in Rio Bravo. And he said, he told a reporter in Tucson during location work, the fellow I play in this picture kills 6 or 8 people. There's not much of that sort of thing in the adventures of Ozzie and Harriet. That's actually pretty funny because, yeah, I mean, he was so unbelievably wholesome. So now we've had the tragedy of the death of Rick Nelson, and as Matthew and Gunnar explained, they lived there for a few short months after their father's passing and then really noticed the atmosphere got a lot more dark and a lot more aggressive and despairing after Rick passed. And they both said, we're done, we are out of here. And they packed up and left. And that's even after their sister, who had her own stories and experiences at the house, she had already hightailed it out of there a few years prior. So the next chapter in the book, Errol Flynn Slept Here, is going to be chapter 10. And it's going to be called This Old Haunted House. And I'm going to read to you the little preface that starts before the chapter to get you in the mood for it. It's from the authors, their note, and they say, we set out to write an entertaining and factually indisputable account of the life and death of Mulholland Farm based on documented sources, credible correspondence, and new interviews. We plan for one short sidebar about the paranormal activity at the house, sort of, ha, isn't this weird? But after 4 years of research, we weren't laughing about the ghosts of Mulholland Farm, and our sidebar became a chapter. So I can't wait to get into more of the eerie aspects of the house that Errol Flynn built, Mulholland Farm, and was the ghost and the energy of Errol Flynn still roaming around the house and grounds? I actually believe it. As I've mentioned in so many episodes in this series, I believe Errol Flynn is in purgatory, and I believe the man needs prayer. So I continue to put the soul of Errol on my prayer list. I really think that if anybody needs some help and some prayer, it's Errol. So if you want to get caught up on the series, if you want to know exactly why I'm praying for a man like Errol Flynn, you're just going to have to get into the series and find out. Like and share and subscribe if you like these kind of videos. And if you love old Hollywood, I want you to check out my Joan Crawford playlist. I read one of the books she wrote called My Way of Life by Joan Crawford. It is fantastic. So many great tips in that book, from beauty tips to decorating tips, entertaining dining. And I was saying in some of those episodes that if anyone deserved her own Netflix series, it was Joan. Not Meghan Markle, but Joan. So anywho, thank you guys so much for watching. I'll see you on the next one. I'll talk to you soon. Bye.